Judge Harlan Voss didn't even look up from his desk when he signed her death warrant. That was the part Eliza Rowan could never shake. Not the fear, not the cold, not the 3 days she spent crawling through snow with nothing but a wool coat and a prayer she didn't believe in anymore. It was the casualness of it, the way a man with soft hands and a gold pocket watch could destroy a woman's entire life without spilling a single drop of his morning coffee. He forged the ledger, stamped her name on a theft she never committed. And when she stood in his doorway with the real numbers in her shaking hand, proof of his corruption, not hers, he smiled at her the way you smile at something small and helpless before you decide what to do with it. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl." Those were the last words she heard before she ran. And now, 3 states away, buried under 4 feet of Colorado snow with her lungs burning and her legs refusing to move another inch, she was starting to wonder if he'd been right about her all along. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do or watched a powerful person walk away without consequences, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me until the end. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories we tell on this channel are the kind that don't let go of you. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the mountain. The blizzard came in fast, the way the worst things always do. 1 hour the sky was steel gray and manageable. The next it was a wall of white moving sideways across the San Juan Range, swallowing pine trees whole, erasing the difference between the trail and the drop-off beside it. Thorne Callahan had seen 31 winters in these mountains, and he knew, the way you know a bad fever just by the color of someone's skin, that this one meant business. He was checking his last trap line of the season, a quarter-mile loop through a stand of spruce he'd been working since October, when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. He pulled his scarf up over his nose, turned back toward the cabin, and that's when his boot caught on something that wasn't a root. He looked down. She was half buried already. Face down, one arm stretched out in front of her like she'd been reaching for something just beyond her fingers when she finally gave out. Her coat was wrong for the mountains, a city coat, heavy wool but not waterproofed, soaked through and probably tripling its own weight against her body. Her boots had no grip on the soles. Her bare hands were the color of raw meat. Thorne Callahan was not a man who panicked. He'd pulled a horse out of a frozen creek once. He'd splinted his own broken finger with a stick and a bootlace and kept working. But when he rolled that woman over and saw her face, the bluish tint at her lips, the shallow flutter of her chest, something cold that had nothing to do with the storm moved through him. She was alive. Barely. He didn't think. He bent down, got his arms under her, and lifted. She was heavy. Genuinely, solidly heavy, and the snow had soaked into every layer she wore. And Thorne was not a small man, but he felt the effort in his lower back immediately, felt his boots slipping in the new accumulation. He adjusted, redistributed her weight, and started moving. The cabin was 6 minutes away in good conditions. In this it would be 20, maybe more. He counted his steps. That was something his father had taught him. When things get bad, count. It keeps the mind from going somewhere unhelpful. He made it in 18 minutes. He remembered every one of them. He got the fire going before he did anything else, because warmth first. That was the rule. Hypothermia killed slower than it seemed, but it killed thorough. He stripped the soaked coat off her, worked the frozen laces of her boots with fingers that weren't much warmer than hers, peeled off the outer layers while keeping the inner ones against her skin the way you were supposed to. He got her onto the cot near the stove, piled every blanket he owned on top of her, and then he sat back on his heels and looked at her face in the firelight and thought, who in God's name were you running from, and did they follow you here? Because people didn't end up alone on a mountain trail in a blizzard by accident, not dressed like that, not without supplies, not without a horse or a pack, or even a canteen. She wasn't lost. She was fleeing. He kept that thought close but didn't do anything with it yet. There was no use in worrying about what she was until she was alive enough to be worth worrying about. He heated water, wrapped a hot cloth around her hands, replaced it when it cooled. He watched her chest rise and fall with the single-minded focus of a man who had decided this woman was going to live and was not particularly interested in arguments to the contrary. Around midnight, her color started coming back. Around 2 in the morning, she made a sound, a small, involuntary moan, the kind that meant pain, which meant feeling, which meant her nerves were waking back up. Thorn leaned forward. "Hey," he said, not gentle exactly, but steady. "You're inside. You're warm. You're okay." Her eyes didn't open, but her hand moved, just slightly, pulling the blanket tighter. He let out a long breath he hadn't known he was holding. He slept in the chair by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Old habit, he'd learned a long time ago that whatever kind of trouble a person brought with them, it rarely waited for daylight before showing up. She was awake when morning came. Sitting up on the cot, blankets pulled to her chin, eyes moving around the cabin with the quick, cataloging look of someone assessing exits. Thorn was at the stove. He poured a mug of coffee without turning around. "There's one door," he said. "You'll need your boots, which aren't dry yet. And it's still blowing hard enough outside to take you down again inside of 10 minutes, so I'd think carefully before you decide I'm worse than the mountain." A long silence. "I wasn't going to run," she said. Her voice was rough, scraped, raw. "You were measuring the door." He turned then, brought the coffee over, held it out. "I've seen that look before. Usually on deer." She stared at the mug for a moment, then took it. Her hands were wrapped. He'd bandaged the worst of the frostbite on her fingers during the night, and she held the mug carefully, favoring the right hand more than the left. "Thank you," she said, "for—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider whatever word she'd been reaching for. "For bringing me in?" "Wasn't a real choice in it," he said, and went back to the stove. "What's your name?" Another pause. Shorter this time, but he noticed it. "Eliza," she said. "Eliza Rowan." Thorn nodded. Didn't give his own name yet. Let the space sit there. "Thorn Callahan," he said eventually. "This is my land, my cabin." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You want to tell me what you were doing on my mountain without so much as a canteen?" "I got turned around in the storm," she said. The lie was quiet and practiced and not particularly convincing, but he let it go. People had reasons for not telling the truth, and most of those reasons were either shame or fear, and neither one of those was helped by being pushed at before someone was ready. He'd learned that too. "Turned around from where?" he asked instead. She hesitated. "Ridgeline Road. I was trying to reach Millhaven." Millhaven was 40 miles east. The nearest settlement from this side of the mountain was Colder Creek, and that was 12 miles south. Nobody coming from the Ridgeline Road ended up here unless they'd been walking hard and scared for a long time. He didn't say any of that. "Eat something," he said. "Then sleep. We'll figure out the rest when the storm breaks." Oh, the storm didn't break for 4 days. Thorn was a man who did well with solitude, had been doing well with it for the better part of a decade, in fact, but he was not prepared for what 4 days of snowbound proximity did to his sense of who Eliza Rowan was. She was afraid, yes. That was always present, always living just beneath whatever surface she showed. But she was not fragile. That was the thing that surprised him first. She was up on the second morning before he was, feeding the stove with wood he'd stacked by the door, moving around his kitchen with the confident economy of a woman who had spent serious time in one. She made biscuits from his flour and lard that were better than anything he'd made himself. She didn't ask permission. She didn't apologize. She just did it. "You're a cook," he said when she set the pan on the table. "Was," she said. Corrected herself so fast it probably wasn't even intentional. He looked at her. She looked at the biscuits. "Good work," he said, and they left it at that. She slept a lot those first 2 days, her body still working its way back from the cold, he figured. But when she was awake, she was watchful in a way that wasn't paranoia so much as practice. She heard sounds before he did sometimes. She was always positioned with her back to a wall and a clear line of sight to the door. Small things. The kind of things a person picked up when they'd been living scared for a while. On the third day, he found her sitting by the small window, her forehead pressed against the glass, watching the snow like it owed her something. "It's going to be 4 more days at least before the trail down clears," he said. She didn't startle, just turned her head slightly. "I know. You're welcome to stay until it does. I don't want to be trouble." He almost said "you already are," but it wasn't exactly the kind of trouble he'd meant. You're not, he said instead. I've got enough provisions. She nodded, turned back to the window, and then quietly, so quietly he almost missed it, I haven't slept 4 whole nights in one place in 6 weeks. He didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer with. He just went back to mending a piece of harness by the fire and let the statement be what it was. The first real thing she'd told him. The deputy arrived on day 6. Thorne heard the horse before he saw anything, that focused, particular sound of hooves in packed snow coming up the south approach. He was at the woodpile when it registered, and everything in him went very still in the way it did when something required thinking fast. He looked at the cabin, looked at the tree line, went inside. Eliza was at the stove. She heard his face before he said anything. Whatever she saw in it made her put down the ladle she was holding and take one slow step backward toward the inner wall. "Someone's coming," he said. She didn't scream, didn't cry. The color left her face in one clean wave, like a tide pulling back, and what was left underneath was a terrible, exhausted recognition. Like she'd been waiting for this and hating herself for letting her guard down in the warmth. "How many?" she said. "1 horse. Could be more behind." He looked at her steadily. "Is there something you want to tell me before they get here?" Her jaw worked. She looked at the door, then at him. And in that moment he saw it. Not guilt, not calculation, but something much worse. The look of a person who was completely and absolutely out of road. "I didn't steal anything," she said. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "I want you to know that. Whatever they say, I didn't do it." Thorne held her eyes for 3 full seconds. "Okay," he said. Then he went to the door and bim. The deputy's name was Burl Nesson. Thorne had seen him twice before, in Colder Creek, a lean man with a neat mustache and the kind of confident stillness that came from carrying a badge long enough to stop thinking of it as a responsibility and start thinking of it as a personality. He had a folded paper in his hand before he even dismounted. "Callahan," he said. Nod. "Professional." "You alone up here?" "Generally speaking," Thorne said. Nesson unfolded the paper and held it out. It was a bounty poster, hand-printed, recently done, with a physical description that was specific enough to mean someone with access to real information had written it. Female, heavy-set, early 30s, brown hair, gray eyes. Wanted on charges of theft and fraud. Eliza R., alias unknown. $500 reward. Thorne looked at the paper, looked at Nesson. His face gave absolutely nothing. "You seen anyone matching this?" Nesson said. The word was already forming in his mouth. "No." Simple, clean, believable. He lived alone. He saw no one. The storm would explain any tracks, and then he thought about the way she'd looked at him from the cot that first morning, measuring the door, ready to bolt on legs that could barely hold her, because that was what you did when trust had been used against you enough times. He thought about her voice. "I didn't steal anything." He thought about a judge with soft hands and a gold pocket watch signing papers without looking up, and he opened his mouth and said something he had absolutely no plan for. "She's my lawful wife." The silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. Nesson's eyes didn't change right away. They just calculated. Moved from Thorne's face to the cabin door, back to Thorne's face. "That's so. Married last autumn, down in Colder Creek. Reverend Aldous. You can check the record." He didn't know if there was a record. He didn't know if Reverend Aldous would cover for him. He'd never spoken more than 2 sentences to the man. He was building this lie out of air and standing in it like it was stone. "She inside?" "She is." "Mind if I come in?" "I do, actually." Thorne's voice was exactly the same as it always was, level, almost bored. "My wife's unwell. She was caught out in the blizzard, nearly didn't make it back. She doesn't need a deputy questioning her while she's still recovering, and frankly, I don't particularly want one in my home without cause." Nesson studied him, a long, uncomfortable study. "The woman I'm looking for is wanted for serious crimes." "My wife isn't wanted for anything?" "You sure about that?" Thorne looked at him. I've been sure about my wife since the day I married her. Now, I don't mean any disrespect, Deputy, but if you've got papers charging Eliza Callahan with something, I'd like to see them. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd take your search further on." The pause stretched. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the cabin, barely audible, a ladle scraped against a pot. Domestic. Ordinary. Nesson folded the paper, tucked it into his coat. "I'll be back through in a few weeks," he said, "to verify the registration." "You're welcome to," Thorne said. He watched the deputy ride back down the trail until the trees swallowed him. Then he turned around, walked back inside, closed the door, and stood with his back against it. Eliza was in the center of the room. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was shaking, very slightly, in the way a person shakes when the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." "He'll come back." "I know." "When he does, the lie won't hold." Thorne pushed off the door and went to pour himself a cup of coffee, because he needed something to do with his hands, and he needed a moment before he said the next thing out loud. "Not unless it stops being a lie," he said. He put the cup down and looked at her over it. He said, "A few weeks. That's enough time to ride to Colder Creek and talk to the Reverend. It's enough time to file the paperwork proper." He held her gaze. He wanted her to understand he wasn't saying it the way a man said something because he wanted something in return. He was saying it the way a man stated a fact about weather or terrain. "The question isn't whether I'm willing. The question is whether you trust me enough." Eliza Rowan looked at him for a long time. She had learned in the last 6 weeks to distrust quickly and trust never. She had learned that soft voices sometimes preceded the hardest betrayals. She had learned that the world held more Harlan Vosses than she'd ever imagined. Men who looked at a woman her size and decided she was either invisible or useful, and never once considered she might be neither. This man had carried her out of the snow, fed her, let her sleep, lied to a deputy's face without asking her a single thing in advance. He wasn't doing it because she was beautiful, or because she was helpless. He was doing it because he'd looked at that bounty poster and made a decision about what kind of person he was. She understood that. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but she understood it. "I trust you enough," she said quietly. And then, because she couldn't help it, the faintest edge of dark humor found its way into her voice, the first time she'd felt anything close to that in longer than she could count. "Thorne Callahan, you're a complicated man to owe a debt to." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but the shape of it was there. "Don't owe me anything," he said. "Just don't lie to me again." She looked at him. "The storm," she said. "I didn't get turned around. I was running." "I know," he said. "I've been running for 6 weeks." "I know that too." She took a breath, held it, let it go. "There's more," she said. "Things I need to tell you. Things about who I was running from and what he's capable of." Thorne pulled a chair out from the table, turned it backward, sat down with his arms across the top of it. Waiting, unhurried. The fire crackled, the snow pressed against the window with a sound like patience itself. "Then tell me," he said. And for the first time in 6 weeks, Eliza Rowan sat down in a warm room with a cup of coffee in her bandaged hands and told someone the truth. She talked for a long time, not all at once. It came out the way things do when someone has been carrying weight alone for too long, in pieces, circling back, correcting herself, stopping when her throat got tight and starting again when it loosened. Thorne didn't interrupt, didn't rush her. He refilled her coffee once without being asked, and that small gesture, the ordinary decency of it, made her eyes go wet in a way the fear never had. Judge Harlan Voss was not the kind of man who looked dangerous on the surface. That was the first thing she told Thorne, and she said it like it was important, like she needed him to understand that she hadn't been naive, hadn't been stupid, that the warning signs she'd missed hadn't been warning signs at all until it was too late. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, well-dressed, the kind of man who got called distinguished without anyone stopping to ask what he'd actually done to earn the word. He'd been a circuit judge in Denver for 11 years. He had a wife, a daughter in a finishing school back east, membership in 2 social clubs, and a reputation for fair sentencing that had appeared in 2 different newspaper articles. He employed a cook and a housekeeper and a groundsman. And when Eliza had come to interview for the cook's position 3 years ago, he had shaken her hand and looked her directly in the eye and said he didn't care what a person looked like as long as they could do the work. She'd believed him. That was the part she hated most when she looked back on it now. How much she had believed him. "He paid well," she said, "better than anyone else who'd ever hired me. And he left me alone to work. No criticism about my weight, no comments about the way I looked. Most men in a position like that, they can't resist making you feel small. He never did." She looked at her coffee. "I thought he was decent." Thorne said nothing. "Turns out he was just not interested," she said, "in me specifically. He had other things on his mind." What Judge Harlan Voss had on his mind, as Eliza pieced it together over 3 years of working in his house, was money. Not earning it. He earned plenty. But moving it, redirecting it, taking funds from the county's civil administration accounts, running them through a series of ledgers she only half understood, and emerging clean on the other side while the original money vanished into private investments she would never have been able to trace if she hadn't accidentally been handed the wrong set of books one Tuesday afternoon in October. Mrs. Pettigrew, that's the housekeeper, she asked me to bring a file from the judge's study to his afternoon meeting. She had the wrong shelf. I didn't know. Eliza set down her mug. "I saw the numbers in the carriage on the way over. I'm not educated, but I know what I know, and I know what a column of figures is supposed to look like, and what it looks like when something has been taken out of the middle and replaced with a different number." She'd put the file down at the meeting, kept her face composed, gone back to the kitchen, spent 3 days deciding what to do, and in the end had done the thing she'd always believed a decent person was supposed to do. She'd confronted him with it, privately, in his own study, with the door closed. "I told him what I'd seen. I told him I thought there was a mistake, and I wanted to give him the chance to explain it before I went to anyone else." She paused, her jaw tightened. He smiled at me. The same smile, Thorne understood, that she'd told him about before she ran. Small and soft and thoroughly convinced of its own power. He'd told her she was mistaken, that she'd misread the figures, that it was a complicated administrative system that required legal training to interpret, and perhaps she should leave the accounting to the people who understood it. And then he'd said it. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl." And she'd walked out and gone back to work because what else was there to do? And she'd spent 2 weeks convincing herself she was wrong, that she'd misunderstood, that a man with his reputation wouldn't. And then the sheriff had come to the house with a warrant bearing her name. Theft of county funds. The amount listed was $4,200. Her name was on a set of ledgers she had never touched, in handwriting that was a passable imitation of her own if you weren't looking closely. 2 witnesses swore they'd seen her carrying files out of the courthouse. One of them was the groundsman she'd had an argument with the previous spring over a broken window she hadn't been responsible for either. "The sheriff was embarrassed, I think," she said. "He kept not looking at me, but he still put the cuffs on." She'd spent 1 night in a cell. In the morning, she'd been told she would be transferred to the county facility to await trial. The deputy who came to transport her had left her alone in the jailhouse for 20 minutes while he handled paperwork. She'd gone out the window. It was not complicated. She'd been waiting for the window. "I had $11 and a change of clothes and my good coat," she said. "I bought a horse in the first town I came through with a name and just kept riding west. The horse went lame outside of a place called Fortin. I sold it for $4 and started walking." She looked at her bandaged hands. "I've been walking since the 8th of February. Thorne had been quiet through all of it. Now he shifted, resettled his weight on the chair, and looked at her with the kind of attention that wasn't searching for holes in her story, but simply taking it in. "The judge," he said. "What's his full name?" "Harlan Voss, Judge Harlan Voss, 6th Circuit, Denver." He nodded slowly. Then, "You said you saw the real ledger, the one with the actual numbers." "I saw it. I didn't take it." "But you remember what was in it?" She met his eyes. "I have a very good memory. It's how I cook. I don't measure. I remember." She hesitated. "I could write down what I saw, the figures, the dates, the names of some of the accounts. I don't know if it's enough to prove anything, but I remember." Thorne was quiet for a moment longer. Then he stood up, crossed to the fire, and stood with his back to her, looking into it. "Reverend Aldous," he said, "he's not a flexible man. He won't lie for me even if I ask him nicely. Then the deputy will come back and find out you lied, and you'll be in trouble over me on top of everything else." She said it plainly, without apology. She'd run from enough to know that clear-eyed honesty about bad situations was more useful than pretending they weren't bad. "You should tell him the truth when he comes back. Tell him you panicked. He might believe you." Thorne turned around. "I wasn't panicking," he said. "You lied to a deputy." "I made a decision." She stared at him. "What's the difference?" "Panicking is when you do something stupid because you're scared," he said. "I wasn't scared. I looked at that poster, and I looked at you, and I made a call." He paused. "I've made worse ones." There was something in the way he said it that told her the worst calls were real, not rhetorical. She filed that away but didn't reach for it. Everyone carried things they didn't owe strangers on first telling. "The deputy said a few weeks," she said. 3, maybe 4, if the snow holds him up. "And you said we could ride to Colder Creek." "I said it was an option." She stood up. She was taller than he'd expected when she'd first gotten to her feet. Not as tall as him, but not small either. She moved like a person who had learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and no more. A habit born from years of people being annoyed by her existence and her quietly refusing to disappear. "I don't want you to do this out of pity," she said. "I need you to understand that. If you do this because you feel sorry for me or because you think I'm helpless—" "You're not helpless," he said. "Helpless people don't climb out of jail windows." She blinked. Something shifted behind her eyes. "And I don't do things out of pity," he continued. "Takes too much energy to maintain." He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, drank it anyway. "What I'm offering is a practical arrangement. You need a legal name and a legal status the deputy can verify. I need—" He stopped, seemed to consider whether he was going to say the next part. "I filed a land claim last year, 40 additional acres to the east. The territorial office put a note in the file that it would carry more weight with a married man operating a homestead than with a single trapper." He set the mug down. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to survive. The rest we figure out as we go." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You are a very strange man, Thorne Callahan." "Probably," he said. "Do you want breakfast or not?" They rode to Colder Creek on the first clear day, which came 9 days after Nesson's visit. The trail was rough and crusted, and Thorne's roan mare picked her way down it with the careful irritation of an animal that had opinions about the weather and felt they weren't being adequately respected. Eliza had not been on a horse in weeks. Her legs ached and her hands ached, and she held the saddle horn without caring how it looked. And when Thorne glanced back at her once from the lead, she said, "I'm fine," before he could ask, and he nodded and turned back around. Reverend Aldous was a small, thin man in his 60s with a deeply skeptical face and a habit of pressing his lips together when he was thinking. He pressed them together a great deal when Thorne explained what he needed. "This is highly irregular," he said. "I'm aware," Thorne said. "Legally, you need—" "I know what's needed. I'll file the certificate with the territorial registrar myself. I just need you to perform the service and put your signature on the document." Aldous looked at Eliza. She looked back at him steadily, the way she looked at everything. Not defiant, not pleading, just present. "Is this your free and uncoerced choice?" he asked her, and the question was sincere enough that she gave it a sincere answer. "Yes," she said. Aldous pressed his lips together once more. Then he went to his back room and came out with a leather-bound register and a pen. The service took 7 minutes. Thorne stood straight and said the words in a flat, practiced voice, the way you said things you'd decided to say without letting the weight of them push you off balance. Eliza said them quietly and meant them in the only way she was able to right now, as a promise to hold up her end of something, to not flinch from the arrangement she'd agreed to. Aldous signed the register. Then he looked at both of them over his reading glasses and said, "I don't know what's going on here, and I suspect I don't want to, but I'm going to say this once." He looked at Thorne. "You treat her right." Thorne said, "Yes, sir." Aldous looked at Eliza. And you, he paused. Don't let him get too proud of himself. She almost smiled at that. I'll do my best, she said. Gee, what Thorne had not fully anticipated, and what he thought about on the quiet ride back up the mountain, was what it actually meant to have another person living in a space he had built around his aloneness. He was not a difficult man to live with, technically speaking. He was clean, he was quiet, he didn't drink more than was reasonable, he didn't have a temper that discharged itself onto other people. But he had arrangements, routines, ways he'd built his days that didn't account for another heartbeat in the cabin. In the first week, he kept catching himself waiting for the intrusion to get worse and finding it didn't. Eliza organized the kitchen, not intrusively, just efficiently, moving things to positions that made more sense that he hadn't admitted needed making more sense. She took over the bread baking without discussion because they both understood she was better at it. She went to bed early and woke early and didn't talk until she'd had her first coffee, which was a trait he found unexpectedly comforting. She asked him things, though. That was new. Most people who'd spent any time around him had learned to leave his silences alone. Eliza didn't breach them exactly, but she was willing to sit near them in a way that made them feel less final. How long have you been up here? She asked one evening. He was at the workbench, repairing a snowshoe frame. 11 years, he said. Give or take. Where before? Kansas. Before that, Missouri. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't, not right then. She nodded and went back to the sock she was mending. Then, because she'd answered his questions, he heard himself say, My wife died. In Missouri. Fever. We'd been married 2 years. He kept his eyes on the frame. I came out here after because being around people who knew her was worse than being alone. A long silence. I'm sorry, Eliza said. It was a long time ago. That doesn't always matter. He looked up at that. She was still focused on the sock, needle moving steadily, but she meant it. He could hear that she meant it, not as a polite thing to say, but as something she actually believed. No, he said. It doesn't. He went back to the frame. They didn't talk again for another hour, but the silence felt different afterward. Not emptier, just more honest about what was in it. The hardest days were the ones when the cold kept them inside together for 12 hours, and they had to navigate around each other in a space that suddenly felt aware of itself in a way it hadn't before. Twice he snapped at her, not viciously, not the way a mean man snapped, but the way a private man snapped when he needed 30 minutes alone and couldn't get them. The first time she snapped back, short and clean, and they both went quiet for a while and then moved on without ceremony. The second time, she didn't snap back, she just went to the other side of the room and left him alone. And somehow that was worse because he had to sit with the fact that she'd chosen grace when she didn't owe it to him. I'm sorry, he said, after about 20 minutes. You already apologized in your head, she said. I could tell. That's enough. He looked at her. That's a strange thing to say. You're a strange man. We established that. She didn't look up from her book, one of his, pulled from the shelf without asking, which he'd noticed and said nothing about. You don't owe me a performance of contrition. Just try to warn me next time. I don't usually know it's coming, he said honestly. She looked up at that. Something in her expression went from mild to considering. Neither do I, she said. We'll just have to get used to each other. We'll have to get used to each other. He carried that sentence around for the rest of the day, examining it from different angles. It was a simple sentence. It implied something ongoing. It assumed a future that neither of them had explicitly agreed to. He found he didn't mind it. She wrote the figures down one evening in late March, in a small, neat hand on the back of an old supply manifest. Account numbers, dates, names she remembered from the column headers, numbers that were present in one version of the ledger and missing from another. She handed it to Thorne without explanation, and he read it twice, slowly. Who would you give this to? She asked. If you wanted to do something with it. I know a man in Millhaven, he said, works for the Territorial Land Office. Not law, but he has connections to people who are. He looked at the paper. This is detailed. I told you, I remember. It's not proof on its own, but it's the kind of thing that makes an investigator start looking. He folded it carefully. Judge Voss must know by now you've gone to ground. He'd have expected you to keep running. He expects me to be stupid, she said. It came out colder than she intended, but she didn't walk it back. He expected me to run out of money and turn myself in. He expected me to be exactly what he thought I was. What did he think you were? She looked at him. Nothing worth worrying about, she said. Thorne turned the folded paper over once in his fingers. Then he looked at her in the firelight, her solid, undefeatable posture, the set of her jaw, the gray eyes that held their ground on everything they looked at, and something in his chest moved in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for, and chose, with some effort, not to examine too closely right now. He underestimated you, Thorne said. Yes, she said. That's his problem, then. She didn't say anything more. But she looked at him with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief. Something harder earned than either of those. Something that had been slowly forming across the weeks of bread baking and honest silences and arguments about nothing important and one or two moments that were actually important. And what it was, he thought, was the look of a person who had started, against all their better judgment, to believe that they might be safe. That was the moment, if there was one. Not the marriage ceremony, not the day he'd lied to Nesson at the door. The moment she looked at him like that, like she'd made a decision about him without realizing she was making it. He was going to file the paper with his contact in Millhaven when the trails cleared enough to make the ride. He was going to do what he could to dismantle Harlan Voss from a safe distance, carefully, piece by piece, the way you dismantled a trap without setting it off. And he was going to be here when, not if, when Nesson came back with harder questions and possibly harder company. What he didn't tell her that night, because there was no useful purpose in saying it yet, was that he'd noticed something in Nesson's eyes when the deputy had tucked the poster away. Not defeat, not acceptance. Something more patient and more dangerous than either. Burl Nesson wasn't going to check the marriage record in Colder Creek and ride on. He was going to come back with reinforcements. The spring would bring mud and melt and wildflowers along the south-facing slopes, and it would bring trouble riding hard and carrying paper that said the law was on its side. And there was no amount of bread baking or honest conversation or slowly building trust that was going to stop what was already moving toward them down the mountain road. But for now, the fire was warm and the night was quiet. And Eliza Callahan, on paper, however strange that still felt to both of them, was sitting across from him reading his book, with her feet tucked under her and her coffee going cold on the table beside her. And Thorne let himself have the quiet for exactly as long as it lasted. The contact in Millhaven was a man named Declan Pruitt, who worked out of a cramped corner office in the Territorial Land Building and had the permanent expression of someone who had seen too much paperwork to be surprised by anything anymore. Thorne had done him a favor once, helped recover a stolen survey wagon and the two mules pulling it, and Pruitt had said if he ever needed something looked at quietly, he should come by. Thorne rode down alone in the first week of April, when the lower trails were passable, but only barely, and laid the folded supply manifest on Pruitt's desk without preamble. Pruitt read it twice. Then he looked up. Where'd this come from? Someone with a reliable memory and no reason to lie. Judge Harlan Voss. Pruitt said the name the way you said the name of a weather system that was technically still far away but moving toward you. Careful, aware of its weight. You understand what you're dropping on my desk here. I understand it needs to go to someone who can do something with it. I understand you know who that is better than I do. Pruitt folded the paper back up slowly. He didn't hand it back. This isn't proof, you know that. I know. It's a start. Starts are expensive when the man at the end of them has friends at the territorial capital. I imagine they are, Thorne said. Are you going to do something with it or not? Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and put the paper inside. I know a federal auditor in Colorado Springs, he said. We've corresponded. Man named Teague. He has no love for circuit judges who play fast and loose with county funds. Had a case like it 3 years ago that went bad because the evidence came too late. He closed the drawer. I can write him. No promises. That's all I'm asking. Pruitt leaned back. The woman this information came from, she's got a warrant on her. She's got a fraudulent warrant built by the same man whose financial records she accidentally saw. That's a story I'd need evidence to back. Which is why you're writing to Teague, Thorne said. Pruitt almost smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. "You're a hard man to argue with, Callahan." "I've been told." He rode back up the mountain with nothing in his hands and nothing guaranteed, and the particular tight feeling in his chest that came from having done the only thing available to him and not knowing if it would amount to anything before the world ran out of patience. Yeah. Spring came to the San Juans the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. 3 warm days followed by a hard freeze. Mud that sucked at boot heels one morning and was solid ground by afternoon. The snowpack on the upper slopes retreating in patches, leaving behind brown grass and exposed rock, and along the creek side, the first thin green of new growth that looked almost indecently hopeful against all that gray. Eliza had never spent a spring at elevation before. She watched it happen from the porch in the mornings, with a cup of coffee and an expression Thorne couldn't entirely read. Something between wonder and grief, he thought. The particular feeling of beauty arriving when you aren't sure you deserve to witness it. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't in the habit of narrating other people's emotions at them. What he did do, in the first days of April, was start teaching her to shoot. It wasn't a dramatic decision. He hadn't sat down and decided, today, I will teach my arranged wife to fire a weapon. It had arrived more practically than that. He was cleaning his rifle one afternoon, and she'd watched with the focused attention she gave to everything, and finally said, "I don't know how to use one of those." "I know," he said. "Should I?" He looked at her. "Probably." The first session was disaster at a respectful distance. She was strong. He already knew that, had understood it from the way she'd recovered from near death, and immediately started contributing to the work of the cabin. But strength and accuracy were different tools, and the rifle's kick surprised her badly enough the first shot that she nearly dropped it. "Again," he said. "I almost hit the tree." "You weren't aiming at the tree. Again." She gave him a look that could have removed paint. Then she raised the rifle. She was better the second day. Worse the third, which he'd learned was normal. The body understood something in the first flush of concentration, and then the mind got involved and tangled everything up. The fourth day, she put 3 shots inside a handspan grouping at 40 yards, and stood there looking at the target with an expression that was half satisfaction and half something that unsettled her. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She lowered the rifle. "I just didn't know I could do that." "You can do a lot of things you haven't been told you could do," he said. He hadn't meant it to land as heavily as it did. He was talking about shooting. But she looked at him in a way that said she heard the larger version of it, and he didn't walk it back because it was true in the larger version as well. He showed her the shotgun too. His old greener double barrel, heavy enough that handling it required both arms fully committed to the task. She held it, worked the action a few times, got a feel for the weight. "I probably can't hit anything precise with this," she said. "You don't need to be precise with that," he said. "You just need to be present." She set it down carefully, didn't argue, filed it. They had their worst fight in the 3rd week of April. It started over something small, a comment Thorne made about the way she'd organized the dry goods, which was a comment he did not need to make and which came out sharper than he'd intended because he'd been tense for 2 weeks waiting for riders that hadn't appeared yet and had nowhere productive to put the tension. She didn't yell. That was the thing about Eliza, Bob. She didn't escalate. She went very still and very precise, which was in some ways harder to deal with than yelling. "I have reorganized nothing," she said. "I moved the flower to a lower shelf because I'm shorter than you, and it makes more sense for me to be able to reach it without a stool." I said it was fine. "You said it like it wasn't fine. He stopped. She was right, and he knew it. "I'm sorry." "You've been waiting for them to come back for weeks," she said. Not accusing, just naming the thing. "Yes. So have I." She sat down at the table. "I've been waiting for it since before I got to this mountain. I've been waiting since the night I went out that window in Denver." She looked up at him. "Waiting doesn't get easier with company. It just gets shared. That's all sharing it does." He sat down across from her. "I know that," he said. "Then stop taking the waiting out on my flower." He looked at her. A beat of silence. Then something released in his chest that had been wound tight for too long, and he said, "That's fair. in a voice that had lost its edge entirely. And she nodded once and got up to make dinner, and that was how they settled things. Not with long conversations about feelings, but with the simple, honest mechanics of continuing to exist in the same space and choosing to keep choosing it. What he didn't tell her that night was that he'd sent a second letter to Pruitt asking about Nessen's movements, and Pruitt's response had come back 3 days ago. Nessen had been seen in Millhaven twice in the past month. He'd been asking around about Thorne Callahan, not loudly, not officially, but asking. He'd also sent a wire to Denver. To Denver meant to someone who had an interest in Denver's business. And the only person in Denver with an active interest in Eliza Rowan's whereabouts was a 62-year-old circuit judge with soft hands and a great deal to lose. Thorne had looked at Pruitt's letter for a long time and then folded it up and put it in his coat pocket and didn't take it out again. He would tell her. He would tell her soon. He just needed one more quiet evening first. They came on a Thursday in the last week of April. Thorne heard them before he saw them. 4 horses, maybe 5, coming up the south approach at a pace that wasn't casual. He was splitting wood in the yard when the sound registered. He put the axe down quietly, which was different from putting it down, and went to the door of the cabin. Eliza was inside rolling dough. She looked up when he came in. "How many?" she said. She'd been watching his face long enough now to read the approach of trouble in it. "More than last time." She set down the rolling pin, wiped her hands on her apron. Her face did the thing it always did. The color going, the jaw setting, the eyes sharpening from soft to hard in the space of 2 seconds. Fear that immediately reorganized itself into something functional. He'd seen it enough now to find it extraordinary. She never stopped being afraid. She just refused to let the fear drive. "Get back from the door," he said. He took his rifle from the wall rack, checked the load with practiced hands, and stationed himself to the left of the doorframe, where he could see the approach without being visible through the window. There were 5 of them. Nessen was in front, which Thorne had expected. What he hadn't expected, what he felt as a cold drop of water down the back of his neck, were the other 4. They weren't deputies. They weren't wearing any kind of badge. They were dressed in the practical, unremarkable clothes of men whose job was to be unnoticed until they weren't, and 2 of them had their rifles already out, laid across their saddles with an ease that meant they'd done this kind of thing, enough that it was no longer a statement. Bounty hunters, real ones. Not sheriffs with warrants, but men hired specifically because they didn't care about the procedure between the locating and the collecting. And Nessen riding with them meant the deputy had made his choice about what side of this he was on, and it wasn't the one that required paperwork. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin door. "Callahan," Nessen called out. His voice had changed from the first visit. The professional courtesy was gone, replaced by something blunter. "Come out, and bring your wife." Thorne opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Just him. He didn't bring the rifle out leveled, kept it at his side, casual, which was its own kind of statement. "Deputy," he said, "you brought company this time." Had reason to. Nessen looked older somehow, or just less comfortable in his own authority. A man who had stepped into something he was committed to and was now wondering if the commitment had been wise. "There's a new warrant, more serious than before." "Is there?" Nessen reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Even from 20 yards, Thorne could see it was official. Territorial seal, the whole business. "Arson," he said. "Judge Voss's property in Denver, a warehouse and connected office building, burned down the 17th of March. 3 witnesses place Eliza Rowan in the vicinity." "The 17th of March," Thorne said. He kept his voice flat. "My wife was here on the 17th of March. She has been here since January. I'm the only person on this mountain who can verify that, but I'm standing here verifying it." "A husband's word," one of the bounty hunters said from the left side of the group. He was a heavy-set man with a beard that needed attention, and his voice had the specific amusement of someone who enjoyed watching people understand that their options were running out. "Doesn't count for much." "And the reward?" Thorne asked, looking at Nessen. Nessen's expression shifted, just slightly, something uncomfortable in it. $3,000, he said. $3,000. Thorne let that number sit in the air for a moment. He'd been worth, at his most prosperous, maybe $400 in liquid assets at any one time. 3,000 was a different conversation. 3,000 was the kind of money that turned the merely flexible into the completely committed. Nessun, Thorne said quietly, not loudly enough for the bounty hunters to hear clearly. You know this isn't right. What I know, Nessun said, is that I have a legal warrant. You know who sent it. I know who signed it. That's the same thing under the law. It's not the same thing under any other standard that matters. Nessun looked at him, and for just a moment, one moment, quickly sealed over, Thorne saw something that might have been discomfort, not guilt exactly. Discomfort, the look of a man who had decided that his job description ended where his personal judgment began and was sticking to that decision by force of will. I need you to bring her out, Callahan. No, Thorne said. The word sat there simple and final. The heavy-set bounty hunter moved first. He didn't signal anything, didn't announce it, just brought his rifle up in one practiced motion. Thorne was already dropping to the side when the shot came, and it hit the porch post where he'd been standing with a crack that sent splinters into the air. He got the cabin door open with his shoulder, got inside, and had barely pulled it shut before 2 more shots came through the window, scattering glass across the kitchen table and the rolled dough that was still sitting on it, patient and oblivious to the fact that everything had just changed. Eliza was pressed against the inner wall, the greener in her hands. Where'd you... he started. You showed me where you kept it, she said. He got to the side of the broken window, got an angle on the yard. 2 of the hunters had dismounted and were moving toward the cabin in a flanking approach, using the woodpile in the corner of the small storage shed he'd built last autumn as cover. The other 2 were still mounted, one circling left toward the back. He fired once. The shot hit the shed corner and kicked up a divot of wood, close enough to make the man behind it pull back. He was buying inches of time, not solving anything. Back of the cabin, he said to Eliza. The small window about... If the one who circled left gets there before I stop him, I'll handle it, she said. Eliza, I said I'll handle it. She moved, quick and low without argument or ceremony. He heard her position herself. A few seconds later, he heard the back window scrape open. Then the sound of the greener being cocked, a sound that had a particular authority to it, the specific voice of a weapon that did not have opinions about what it was pointed at. A shout from behind the cabin. Then silence. The man hadn't come around the corner. Thorne turned back to the front. The heavy-set hunter was working closer, using a line of approach that kept the woodpile between them. Smart, experienced. He'd done this in terrain before. Thorne took a breath, waited, and when the man moved to his next position, a gap he had to cross, Thorne fired. He missed clean. Too much distance, and his angle was compromised by the window frame. The hunter went flat and returned 2 shots that took out what was left of the window glass entirely. Thorne pulled back, reloaded. His hands were steady. They were always steady in moments like this, a fact he'd discovered about himself in an ugly situation 11 years ago and had never been comfortable being grateful for. He's getting closer, Eliza called from the back room. I know. There's another one moving on the east side. He hadn't seen that. How do you know? I can hear the snow crunching, different direction from the first one. He believed her. She had ears that caught things before he did. Had proven it enough times that he'd stopped being surprised and started relying on it. 3 of them on the ground now, closing from multiple angles. The 2 still mounted were positioned to cut off any exit. Nessun hadn't moved, still on his horse 20 yards out, watching, which told Thorne everything about what Nessun had decided his role in this was. He was the face on the paperwork. The hired men were the substance. The firing went on in bursts, not continuous, because no one on either side had ammunition to waste. Thorne's rifle was lever action, 15 rounds in the magazine, and he was on his 7th. The greener had 2. He needed to be exact about this. He moved through the cabin to the rear, got beside Eliza. The man who'd circled left was visible from here, positioned behind a boulder at the tree line, 40 yards out, waiting with the patience of someone being paid by the result rather than the hour. He's not coming closer, she said. He doesn't have to. He's keeping us from the back exit. Thorne calculated. Assessed. The shape of the problem was becoming clear, and it was not a comfortable shape. They could hold the cabin for a while, but not indefinitely. The hired men would simply wait, or send someone for more ammunition, or wait for dark. He looked at Eliza. She was looking out the window at the boulder, and her face had the expression he'd seen once before, that first morning, measuring the door. Except this time it wasn't escape she was measuring. It was something else. Something moving through her that wasn't fear and wasn't recklessness, but was positioned somewhere between the two. A decision assembling itself, piece by piece, in real time. "Don't," he said. She turned to him. "You're down to what? 6, 7 shots? 8. And they have more men than you have bullets. We wait them out. It's my mountain. I know it better than they do. At night, yes." She looked at the window. "It's 2 in the afternoon, Thorn. We've got 5 hours of daylight." She paused. "The one on the east side has been moving for 20 minutes, and he's almost at the cabin wall." She was right. He knew she was right. He just didn't have an answer yet that didn't involve her being in the line of fire. "Let me think," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "since before they stopped their horses." She turned to look at him fully. "You told me I didn't know what I was capable of. You said that." "I was talking about shooting at a target." "I know what you were talking about." Her voice was quiet and absolutely level. Not brave in the showy sense, not performing courage. Just steady in the way a person was steady when they'd reached the floor of their fear and found it was solid ground. They came up here expecting to find a woman hiding. They planned for that. A woman behind a man, tucked away waiting to be collected. She looked at the greener, then at him. They didn't plan for anything else. Thorn looked at her. A long, hard look. "That man on the east wall gets to the corner. He'll have a shot through the front room window," she said. "You'll have to deal with him. That's going to leave the front uncontested for maybe 30 seconds. He saw it. The shape of what she was proposing. His chest tightened in a way that was not about tactics. "You'll be on the porch," he said, "for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a long time in a gunfight." "I know." She held his eyes. "Thorn, I have been running for 4 months. I am done running." He looked at her. He thought about the woman he'd found in the snow, barely alive, reaching for something she couldn't reach. He thought about what she'd built in his cabin across the winter, not out of obligation or debt, but out of the specific dignity of a person who was going to survive regardless of what the world threw at them, and was going to do it on their own terms. He thought about the fact that she was right, about the 30 seconds, about the East Side Hunter, about all of it. "Stay low," he said. "Don't stand up straight. Keep the porch post between you and Nesson's position." "I know." "The greener kicks hard. Brace before you fire." "I remember." He put his hand on her arm for 1 second. Just one. Then he moved. The East Side Hunter was close. Thorn could hear him now too, the specific sound of a body moving carefully through softening snow. He positioned himself at the front room window, angled to cover the cabin's east corner, and he waited. The hunter came around the corner. Thorn fired. The shot took the man in the shoulder and spun him hard into the cabin wall, and the sound of it was still hanging in the air when the front door opened and Eliza Rowan walked out onto the porch of the cabin she'd spent the winter making into something worth defending, and she raised the greener, and she was not hiding behind anything. The effect was immediate and complete, and Thorn would remember it the rest of his life. The heavy-set hunter who'd been making his approach on the woodpile came up from his crouch to see what was happening. Because you heard a door, and you looked, that was human instinct, 400,000 years of it. And what he saw stopped him like a wall. Not because the woman on the porch was fearsome in the way of the terrifying, because she was fearsome in the way of the entirely unexpected. She was standing in open ground, injured hands wrapped and steady, with a 12-gauge leveled at his position and an expression that had nothing theatrical in it whatsoever, and the complete absence of theater was more frightening than any performance would have been. "You're in the open," she said to him, her voice carried perfectly in the mountain air. "I am not." He froze. The mounted rider to the left had pulled his horse up short at the sight of her. The man at the boulder in the tree line hadn't moved. Nesson on his horse had gone very still in a way that looked like a man urgently reviewing the decisions that had led him to this specific point in his life. Thorn came through the door behind her, one shot remaining in the rifle. He used it to shatter the boulder to the left of the tree-line hunter, not hitting him, but close enough that the man scrambled backward by pure reflex. Then he moved to Eliza's left, creating 2 points of coverage, and looked at the heavy-set hunter who was still frozen by the woodpile. "Put it down," Thorn said. A long moment. The rifle went into the snow. The other mounted rider looked at Nesson. Nesson was not looking at anyone. Nesson was staring at the porch and the woman standing on it, and whatever he'd expected to find at the top of this mountain when he'd ridden up here with hired guns and fresh warrants and $3,000 of someone else's money sitting in his future, it had not been this. It could not have been this. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight of a woman who'd been running for 4 months and nearly died in a blizzard standing in open sunlight with a 12 gauge in the face of someone who had simply decided they were done. The tree-line hunter was gone. Thorn could hear him moving back through the snow, retreating to where the horses were tied. The east side man was down, clutching his shoulder, not going anywhere. That left the heavy-set one by the woodpile, the 2 mounted riders, and Nesson. Thorn looked at all of them and did the arithmetic that the silence was demanding. "Your move, deputy," he said. Nobody moved for what felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 15 seconds. 15 seconds is nothing in an ordinary life. In a standoff on a mountainside with 5 men and 2 firearms and a wounded man bleeding quietly into the snow by the cabin wall, 15 seconds is its own kind of eternity. Thorn counted them the way his father had taught him. Not by the clock, but by his own heartbeat, which was slower than it had any business being and had been since the first shot was fired. He'd made peace with that particular fact about himself a long time ago. It wasn't bravery, it was just the way his body was built. Eliza hadn't moved either. She was still on the porch, still holding the greener with both arms fully committed to it, still looking at the heavy-set hunter by the woodpile with the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose by being honest about what she was willing to do. The heavy-set man's name, as it turned out, was Corbin Wade. Thorn learned that later. In that moment, he was just a man with a rifle in the snow and a very clear understanding that the situation had moved outside the parameters he'd been hired for. Wade looked at Nesson. Nesson didn't look back. That was when Thorn understood that the deputy had already made his internal calculation and arrived somewhere uncomfortable. Nesson was a man who operated on the authority of paper. Documents, seals, warrants, the weight of institutional backing that let a man of ordinary courage do extraordinary things because the law was technically behind him. Take that away, or rather, let him stand in the presence of 2 people who had looked at his paper and chosen their own mountain over it. And what was left was just a man on a horse who wanted to go home. "Wade," Nesson said finally. His voice was even but thin. "Pick up your rifle." "I don't think that's wise," Thorn said. "That's not your decision." "It is while I'm standing in my own yard." Another silence. The wounded man by the cabin wall made a sound, not loud but present. A reminder that the situation had already crossed the line between confrontation and consequence, and there was nothing theoretical about it anymore. One of the mounted riders, the younger one, barely past 20, who hadn't fired a single shot, was looking at the tree line where the 4th hunter had disappeared, looking at it with the eyes of a man who was doing addition. 4 horses, 2 covered exits, 1 woman with a shotgun who had walked out into open ground without flinching. The arithmetic wasn't adding up to the outcome he'd been promised. "How much are they paying you?" Eliza said to the young rider. Not aggressive, almost conversational, like she genuinely wanted to know. He looked at her, confused by the question, which was probably the point. "Whatever it is," she said, "the man who sent you here is going to jail inside of 6 months. And when he does, every warrant he ever signed goes up for review." She paused. "Which means you rode up a mountain and shot at innocent people for a document that won't exist." "She doesn't know that," Nesson said sharply. "No," Thorn said, "but I sent Voss's financial records to a federal auditor in Colorado Springs 3 weeks ago, so she might." That landed differently than he expected. He'd said it to move the situation, but the actual effect on Nesson's face was something larger. A visible reorganization of the man's understanding of where he was standing and what he'd walked into. Not just a trapper and a fugitive woman, something that had already reached beyond this mountain and was pulling on things in places that had offices and telegraphs and the kind of institutional patience that outlasted any individual's ability to run. The young rider looked at Nesson. "Is that true?" "He's bluffing," Nesson said, "but he said it the way you said something you hoped was true, rather than the way you said something you knew." "Pruitt at the Millhaven Land Office has the name Teague," Thorne said to no one in particular, still watching Nesson. "Federal auditor. Specialized in county fund misappropriation. He's been looking for a reason to open a case on the Sixth Circuit for 2 years. He kept his rifle easy at his side, but his attention absolutely fixed. The reason is now documented and submitted. That's done. It happened before you rode up here. Nothing that happens on this mountain today changes that." Nesson's jaw worked. The young rider made a decision. He was young enough that the decision showed clearly on his face before he acted on it. A brief visible internal argument, and then resolution. He reached down and holstered his revolver, which he'd had in his hand since they'd stopped their horses. Then he looked at Wade and said, very simply, "I'm not dying for $3,000. He turned his horse and walked it back down the trail. Wade watched him go. Then he looked at Nesson, then at Eliza on the porch, who had not lowered the greener and showed no signs of doing so. "I want to get Moss," he said, nodding toward the wounded man by the wall. "Just get him and walk out." "Nobody's stopping you from tending to your man," Thorne said. "Just do it without the rifle." Wade left the rifle in the snow. He walked to the wounded man, Moss apparently, and got an arm under his good shoulder and helped him up. Moss was pale and moving badly but ambulatory, and they made a slow, undignified passage back toward the horses without anyone saying anything. The tree-line hunter was already gone. His horse tracks went back down the east side of the mountain. That left Nesson. Just Nesson, on his horse, in the yard, with the warrant folded in his coat pocket and an expression that had moved past calculation into something raw, not guilt. Nesson wasn't built for guilt, Thorne thought. Not that he was a cruel man, but that he'd organized himself too thoroughly around the idea that his personal responsibility ended at the edge of what the paperwork said. Men like that didn't feel guilt. They felt exposure, which was adjacent but structurally different. Thorne walked off the porch. Eliza stayed where she was. He went to where Wade had left his rifle in the snow and picked it up, unloaded it as he walked, and stopped 10 feet from Nesson's horse. He looked up at the deputy. "Get down," he said. Nesson looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, a brief surge of resistance, the instinct of a man who didn't like being told what to do on the wrong side of a confrontation. Then it faded. He dismounted. Thorne took the warrant from him, which Nesson gave up with the stiff compliance of a man who understood that the document's authority had become theoretical. He unfolded it, read it. The arson charge was specific and elaborate. 3 witnesses, dates, times, a property description with the value of the supposed damage calculated to the dollar. Someone had spent real effort on it. Someone who had soft hands and a gold pocket watch and no particular concern about the people he used to protect himself. "You know this is manufactured," Thorne said. Nesson said nothing. "You rode up here with hired men and rifles. That's not a legal action. That's a hunting party." Thorne folded the warrant and put it in his own coat pocket. "Which means the question of what happens next is mine to answer, not yours." Nesson's expression shifted toward wariness. "I'm a sworn deputy." "Who hired private bounty hunters to assault a private home? The badge doesn't cover everything, deputy." Thorne looked at him steadily. Not with anger. That was the thing Nesson kept clearly not understanding, that this man wasn't operating out of emotion. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. You're going to ride back down to wherever Voss's money is waiting for you, and you're going to send it back. And then you're going to send a wire to the Denver court reporting that the fugitive Eliza Rowan, also known as Eliza Callahan, died in the winter wilderness of the San Juan Range. Lost in a blizzard. Never found. End of warrant. End of search." Nesson stared at him. I can't falsify You can, Thorne said, because the alternative is I ride to Millhaven and I sit down with Pruitt and I give him a very detailed account of a deputy sheriff who participated in an armed assault on a private homestead in coordination with unlicensed bounty hunters. And I let him decide what to pass along to Teague's federal office. And I let them decide whether a man with your level of documented involvement in Voss's operation ought to be sitting in a cell while they sort it out. Silence. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere down the slope, a horse was moving away at a deliberate pace. Wade and Moss, making their exit, while the conversation above them reached its conclusion. Nesson looked at Eliza on the porch. She looked back at him. The greener was lowered now, resting in the crook of her arm, but nothing in her posture suggested it was done being relevant. She walked out on that porch, Nesson said. He didn't say it to either of them specifically. He might have been saying it to himself. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've dealt with actual criminals. Men who killed people, men who burned things down, men who took what wasn't theirs without a second thought. He paused. I've never once had a woman walk out into a gunfight like that. You sent her the wrong message, Thorne said. What message was that? That she had nothing left to stand on. Thorne held his eyes. Turns out she had plenty. Nesson was quiet for a long time. He looked at the snow, at his horse, at the cabin with its broken windows and the porch post with the bullet scar in it from his own men's first shot. Voss isn't going to stop, he said, even if I file the report, even if I tell him she's dead. If your auditor friend stirs up that case, Voss is going to know she's alive and he's going to know it came from here. I know that, Thorne said, and you're not afraid of that. I didn't say that. Thorne looked at him with the flat, matter-of-fact honesty that was the only mode he had. I said I know it. Those are different things. Nesson mounted his horse. He gathered the reins slowly, with the movements of a man who was tired in a way that went past physical. If he sends someone else, then they'll come up a mountain they don't know to find two people who've had all spring to prepare for them, Thorne said. Tell him that too. The deputy looked at him one last time. Something in his expression, not quite respect, not quite remorse, but some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name, passed briefly across his face. Then he turned the horse and rode down. Thorne stood in the yard and watched until the sound of hooves faded into the trees and the mountain went quiet again. The snow around him was churned up and scarred with tracks, and there was a rifle lying in it and a patch of red where Moss had been sitting and 3 spent shell casings near the woodpile that he'd have to pick up later. He became aware of Eliza standing beside him. He hadn't heard her come off the porch. She was just there, suddenly, the greener still in the crook of her arm, her breath making small clouds in the late April air. They stood there for a moment without talking. You're shaking, he said. I know, she said. I noticed. That's normal. I know that too. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, a fine, constant tremor that was the body's honest report on what the mind had pushed it through. I wasn't scared while it was happening. I know. I'm scared now. That's how it works, he said. She looked at him. Does it stop? He thought about being honest and decided she deserved it. It fades. It doesn't really stop. She nodded, accepted that without argument. Then she looked at the yard, the damage, the tracks, the general wreckage of what had been an ordinary spring afternoon before 5 men had ridden up and redefined it. The windows, she said, I'll board them tonight. Get glass from Colder Creek when the road's better. The porch post will hold. It's just surface damage. She was quiet. He could feel her processing, not falling apart, not performing composure, just actually processing it the way she did everything, steadily and at her own pace, and without asking permission. He said Voss won't stop, she said. He said it like it was a warning, Thorne said. I took it as information. What do we do with it? He looked at the mountain around them, the slopes he knew by memory, the trails he could walk blind, the particular way the light came through the trees in late afternoon that told him exactly where he was without looking at anything else. His mountain, 11 years of it, every rock and ridge and hidden path through the spruce stands. We wait for Pruitt to hear back from Teague, he said. We give the federal case time to move. And we make sure that if anyone else rides up here before it does, they find us ready. He looked at her. That's not a comfortable answer. No, she said, but it's honest. A pause. I've had enough comfortable, dishonest answers to last me. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. Come inside. I'll look at your hands. My hands are fine. You fired a 12 gauge with frost damage on your fingers. Come inside. She came inside. So, the days after the gunfight had a strange quality to them. Not peaceful exactly. Too much had shifted for peace to settle back in naturally, but quiet in the way that follows something loud. They moved through the cabin carefully, not around each other's feelings exactly, but around the new shape of what they'd been through together, which had no category either of them had experienced before, and therefore no established rules for navigating. Thorne fixed the windows first, boarded them temporarily, then rode to Colder Creek for glass panes and came back and installed them over 2 days, working with the focused attention he brought to any physical task that needed doing right. Eliza cooked around the work without complaint, handing him things when he needed them without being asked, which required her to pay a different kind of attention to what he was doing than most people would have bothered with. He noticed that. He didn't say it. She wrote a letter with his knowledge and his paper and his ink addressed to a woman named Dorothea Voss, the judge's wife, that she spent 3 evenings composing and twice threw in the fire before the third version satisfied her. He didn't read it. She didn't offer to show him. What she told him was, "She was never cruel to me." I don't know if she knew. I think maybe she should have the chance to know. He didn't agree or disagree. He sealed it and added it to a bundle going to Pruitt, with a note asking Pruitt to see it delivered through indirect channels that couldn't be traced back to the mountain. Pruitt's next letter arrived in the second week of May. It was short and carefully worded in the way of a man who understood that letters could be read by people other than their intended recipient. Teague interested, moving forward with preliminary inquiry. Expect formal process by summer. Advise patience. Your earlier contribution received well. Eliza read it twice. Then she set it on the table and sat looking at it without expression for a while. It's starting, she said. It's started, he corrected. Starting implies it hasn't begun. She looked up at him. That's a very precise distinction. It matters. He sat down across from her. Starting means it might still not happen. Started means the only question is how far it goes. She held his eyes. He'd learned, over the months of winter and now spring, to hold hers in return, which was something he'd had to actually practice, not because she was intimidating, but because he was a man who had spent 11 years avoiding the kind of sustained mutual attention that committed you to being known by another person. It was a harder habit to break than he'd expected, but she'd broken it, not by demanding it, but by simply being someone whose face was worth looking at honestly. What happens to me if it works? She asked. If they prosecute him, if it comes out that the warrants were fabricated, what happens to my name? Formally, the charges get dismissed, the warrant gets vacated, you go back to being a person without a criminal record. And informally, he leaned back. This was the part that didn't have a clean answer, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. People talk. Some of them will remember the name and the warrant and not pay attention to what came after. That doesn't disappear. He paused. But it gets smaller, and you keep living forward until there's more living forward than there is story behind you. She considered that. You speak from experience. Some, he said carefully. She didn't reach for what he hadn't offered. That was one of the things about her that had become, without him planning for it, something he valued in a way that felt permanent. She was curious but not invasive. She wanted to know things but understood the difference between what was being shared and what was being withheld and respected the border without making him defend it. Thorne, she said. Yeah. When I walked out on that porch, she stopped, started again. I knew you might not be able to cover me. I knew there were angles you couldn't hold with one rifle. I walked out anyway. I know, he said. I need you to understand why. She pressed her bandaged hands flat on the table, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of grounding herself when she was about to say something that mattered. It wasn't because I didn't care what happened to me. And it wasn't to be brave. It was because I looked at that situation and I looked at this cabin and I thought, I live here, not hiding, not waiting to be found. I live here, and I wasn't going to let them make me something small in my own house. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said again. And then, because it was true and she'd said something true, and that seemed to require it. That's the most courageous thing I've ever seen anyone do. She looked at him. The expression on her face was complicated, moved, and also uncomfortable with being moved, and also stubborn about not letting being moved make her sentimental about it. He recognized all of that because he had the same expression a lot of the time and had learned what it felt like from the inside. Don't make me into something, she said. I'm just a woman who got tired of running. That's not a small thing to be, he said. A silence. Then her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but had all the architecture of one. You're better at this than I expected, she said. At what? She moved her hand in a vague gesture. Saying the right thing at the right time. I don't usually, he said. You just get the version of me that's had months to figure out what you need to hear. That's also a form of paying attention, she said. He looked at her across the table, in the spring light coming through the newly replaced window glass, with the letter from Pruitt between them and the mountain outside doing what it did regardless of what went on inside the small human structures built upon it. And he felt the thing he'd been not examining since the firelight evening when she'd looked at him like she'd decided something. Felt it clearly now, without the careful avoidance, without the distance he'd maintained for 11 years because distance was survivable and the alternative was not. He loved her. That was the plain truth of it. Not the falling kind, not the overwhelming kind, the built kind. The kind constructed day by day from shared meals and honest arguments, and the slow, irreversible accumulation of knowing someone well enough that their absence would leave a specific shaped hole that nothing else would fill. He didn't say it. She didn't need him to say it yet. They were both people who had learned that saying things too early could cheapen them, and that some things earned their words by waiting. What he said instead was, "The east fence needs work before summer. I could use a hand if you're willing." She looked at him. She saw something in his face. He could tell she saw it because she was Eliza, and she watched things the way she'd always watched the door. And whatever she saw, she chose to meet it the same way he had, by not rushing it. "I'm willing," she said. They went out to work the fence that afternoon. The mountain was warming into itself. The snowpack a memory now except on the highest ridges. The trails hardened and solid, the aspens in new leaf along the lower slopes making a sound in the wind like running water. Thorne showed her how to set a post properly, how to test the tension of the wire, what to look for in the ground before you dug. She learned the way she learned everything, attentively, without false modesty about what she didn't know, without performing incompetence either. Her hand still hurt. She worked anyway. He watched her drive a post with the mallet, correcting her grip once without making a thing of it, and she adjusted without comment and drove the next one cleaner. They moved down the fence line together, working in the particular rhythm of two people who had figured out how to exist in proximity without managing each other. At some point, he realized he wasn't thinking about Nesson, wasn't calculating Voss's next move, wasn't holding his breath for the sound of hooves on the south approach. He was just working. With her. On his mountain, which was in some way he didn't try to formalize also hers now, not because of a piece of paper Aldous had signed in 7 minutes, but because she had walked out on that porch and claimed it, and no warrant and no hired gun and no judge with a pocket watch was going to unclaim it. "Thorne," she said, without stopping work. "Yeah, but thank you for not treating me like I needed to be protected from the truth." He looked at her. She was tamping dirt around a new post and not looking back. "What truth?" "Any of it," she said. "The real odds, what Nesson said, what might still come. Some men—" She paused. "Some men decide that honesty is unkind, and they choose kindness, and they think they're doing you a favor." "I know the kind," he said. "You're not that." "No," he said. "I'm not." She nodded, moved to the next post. "Good," she said. And that was all she said, and it was exactly enough. The afternoon light stretched long across the mountain. The fence took shape behind them, post by post and wire by wire. The most ordinary work in the world. Below them, somewhere down the winding trails and through the mountain passes and across the miles of territory that separated this elevation from civilization, a federal auditor named Teague was looking at a set of figures that a woman with a reliable memory had written on the back of a supply manifest. And a judge with a gold pocket watch was sitting in his office not yet knowing what was building against him, or that the woman he'd tried to erase was up on a mountain in the San Juans driving fence posts in the spring sun. She was not hiding, she was not waiting, she was building something in the most straightforward and unromantic sense of the word. Boards and wire and labor and the slow accumulation of days that belonged to her and no one else. And for the first time in 4 months, Eliza Rowan did not feel like prey. The letter from Teague arrived on a Tuesday in the middle of June, folded inside a larger envelope from Pruitt that also contained 3 pages of his own notes, written in the cramped, careful hand of a man who understood that what he was putting on paper might eventually be read by people with more authority than himself. Thorne read it at the table while Eliza stood by the stove, pretending to be more interested in the soup she was stirring than she actually was. He read it once, then again, then set it down flat and looked at it for a moment before sliding it across to her. She read it standing up. She read it the way she read everything, completely, without rushing, going back to reread the parts that needed it. When she was done, she set it down next to his copy and went back to the soup and stirred it twice more, and then turned the flame down and sat. "He's opened a formal inquiry," she said. "Full audit of the Sixth Circuit accounts. 3 years back." Thorne leaned on the table. "Teague's good at this," Pruitt says. "He found discrepancies in the first week that confirm what you remembered. My memory didn't need confirming." "No," he said. "But federal auditors don't run on memory. They run on ledgers. Now they have both." She was quiet. Outside, the mountain was doing what it did in June, everything growing faster than seemed reasonable, the creek running high with snowmelt, the air having that particular quality of mornings at elevation in early summer that felt almost aggressive in its cleanness. "Will they arrest him?" she said. "Teague's letter says the evidence supports charges of misappropriation of public funds, fraud, and obstruction." Thorne paused. "The obstruction is the manufactured warrant, your warrant." She looked at him. "They know it was manufactured. The arson charge especially. Teague says 2 of the 3 witnesses have already recanted when interviewed separately. Turns out they weren't paid enough to hold the story under federal questioning." He paused again. "The 3rd one is the groundsman. He hasn't recanted yet." "He won't," she said. "He believed what he said. Voss gave him a version of events that he accepted because he already didn't like me." She said it without bitterness. Just accurate, the way she stated most things. "That's how it works. You don't need to pay everyone. You just need one person with genuine reasons, and the rest fall into line." Thorne looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I was the cook," she said. "I watched how he operated his household for 3 years. I watched how he managed people." She picked up the letter again and looked at the federal seal at the top of it. "He's very good at finding the specific thing a specific person needs to believe and giving it to them in a form they can hold." A pause. "It almost worked on me. I almost believed I'd misread the ledger. What stopped you?" She set the letter down. "Numbers don't lie the way people do. I might misread a person. I don't misread a column that's short by $4,000. He nodded. He'd known this about her for months, but hearing it stated plainly still had an effect on him. The particular quality of a person who had been consistently underestimated and had decided to stop performing down to the expectation. "It'll take time," he said. "Federal cases don't move fast. Months, maybe longer. And it'll get loud when it does move. The newspapers, people talking." "I know." She looked out the window at the mountain. "Can I ask you something? You don't usually ask permission. This is different." She turned back to him. "When this is over, when the warrant is officially vacated and my name is clear, what happens to us?" The question sat between them with the weight of something that had been waiting to be asked for a long time. Thorne picked up his coffee mug, drank from it, put it down. all of which was him buying time while he figured out how to say the true thing in a way that didn't put her in the position of having to manage his feelings on top of her own. "That depends on what you want," he said. "I'm asking what you want." "I know you are." He looked at her directly. "I want you to stay. Not because of the arrangement we made, not because of the land claim or the paperwork or any of the practical reasons that got us here." He kept his voice level because that was the only way he knew how to say important things, plainly, without decoration, because decoration suggested he wasn't sure, and he was sure. "Because this is where I want to be and you're who I want to be here with. That's it. That's the whole answer." She looked at him for a long moment. She had come to this mountain with $11 and a wrong-season coat and less than no reason to trust anyone. She had learned, slowly and with significant evidence required at every stage, that this particular man was exactly what he presented himself as. Not because he was simple, but because he'd made a decision somewhere in his life to spend his energy on being honest rather than on managing what other people thought of him. It was a rare quality. She hadn't known how rare until she'd spent 3 years in the house of a man who was its precise opposite. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay, you'll stay." "Okay, I'll stay." She stood up to check the soup. "Don't make it into a bigger moment than it is." "I wasn't going to." "You had the face of a man about to make it into a bigger moment." "I have one face," he said. "You have at least 3, she said. "I've cataloged them." She stirred the soup. "This one is the one you have when something matters more than you want to let on." He was quiet. "I've noticed it for a while," she said, not unkindly, not teasing exactly, just stating it the way she stated things. Because it was true, and truth was more useful than pretense. "I wasn't sure what to do with it. And now," she looked at him over her shoulder, "now I think it means we're going to be fine." "Oh." The formal arrest of Judge Harlan Voss was reported in the Denver papers on the 14th of August. Thorne read the account aloud at the kitchen table, while Eliza listened with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her face doing something complicated and quiet. The article was thorough, front page, above the fold, the kind of story that newspapers wrote when they'd been sitting on pieces of it for months and could finally put the whole picture together. Misappropriation of county funds dating back 4 years. A total of $11,000 redirected through falsified accounting. 3 civil cases in which rulings had been influenced by financial consideration. The fraudulent warrant issued against a former household employee. An arson charge fabricated with paid witnesses, 2 of whom had provided full statements to federal investigators. The third witness, the groundsman, had apparently reversed his account in the end as well, once it became clear which direction the evidence was moving. Thorne didn't mention that when he read it. Eliza didn't ask. "His wife," she said when he finished. "The article says she was not implicated." She nodded. She'd known that was likely. The letter she'd sent to Dorothea Voss through Pruitt's indirect channels had never received a response, and she'd made peace with that months ago. Some doors, once you walked out of them, simply didn't open again. That was all right. She hadn't sent the letter for a response. She'd sent it because a woman deserved to know the truth about the man she'd built her life around, even when the knowing was the worst thing she'd ever have to absorb. "The warrant," she said. Thorne turned to the second page of the article. "Formally vacated, all charges dismissed." He read the specific language. "The warrant issued against the individual identified as Eliza R. has been found to be a fabrication produced in coordination with falsified witness testimony and is hereby declared null and void as of this date." He set the paper down. "You're not a wanted person anymore." She sat with that. It should have felt larger. She'd expected it to feel larger, some kind of release, a weight dropping, the specific sensation of a held breath finally let go. What it actually felt like was quieter than that, like the ending of a sound she'd been hearing for so long she'd stopped registering it as separate from the silence. It was only gone now that she noticed it had been there at all. "How do you feel?" Thorne asked. She thought about it honestly instead of reaching for the convenient answer. "Strange," she said, "like I've been building toward this for 8 months, and now that it's here, I don't know what to do with my hands." He nodded. "That's normal." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She picked up the newspaper and looked at Voss's name in print. It was a strange thing to see. A name that had lived in her head as a threat, almost a force of nature, reduced to ink and paper like any other fact. He was 62 years old, the article said, and would face sentencing in the fall. His property was under federal lien. His judgeship was revoked. He had signed a document designed to end her life. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. He had put his seal on a lie and sent men to enforce it, and had done all of it without, she suspected, spending a significant amount of time thinking about her as a person. She had been a problem to be managed, an inconvenience that had seen something she shouldn't have seen. That was the part she'd never fully said out loud to Thorne, or to anyone, the part that had sat in her chest like a cold stone through all of it. Not the fear, not the injustice, not even the exhaustion of 6 weeks of running. The specific diminishment of being treated as something so small that your destruction required no particular feeling from the person ordering it. Just a signature. Just a document. Just a hand that didn't even look up. She put the newspaper down. "I want to write something," she said. Thorne didn't ask what. He got up and brought her paper and the inkwell from the shelf and set them in front of her without comment. That was one of the things she'd stopped taking for granted about him. The way he understood the difference between what needed to be said and what needed to be done. She wrote for an hour. He worked on the harness he'd been mending for a week, sitting at the other end of the table, not reading what she wrote and not pretending not to want to. When she was done, she folded the paper and didn't explain it. What she'd written was not a letter to anyone. It was something closer to a reckoning, not with Harlan Voss, but with herself. With the version of herself that had stood in his doorway with a trembling hand and the truth in her fingers, and believed, for just a moment before he smiled, that he was going to tell her she'd misread it and she was going to feel relief. She wrote about that moment. She wrote about what it cost to trust a powerful person and what it cost to stop trusting them and what it cost to trust again afterward. She wrote it because it was in her and needed to come out, and because writing things down was how she made them stop living only inside her. She didn't show it to Thorne. She folded it and put it in the box under the cot where she kept the small things that mattered. A button from her mother's coat, a recipe she'd invented in her 3rd year working for Voss that she was proud of, the supply manifest she'd originally written the financial figures on before transferring them to clean paper. She kept it because it was hers, because she had lived it, and it deserved to be kept. In September, a letter arrived from Pruitt that wasn't about Teague or Voss or warrants at all. It was about a parcel of land adjacent to the South Trail, a half-mile stretch where the road widened before starting the descent toward Colder Creek. The territory was developing that corridor, Pruitt wrote, putting in way stations for the increasing traffic moving through the passes. There was opportunity there for anyone with the inclination and the location. Thorne left the letter on the table for 2 days before either of them talked about it. On the 3rd day, Eliza said, "You've read it 6 times. 3 times, he said. You read it again this morning while I was outside." He picked up his coffee. "You have an unsettling amount of information about what I do when you're not in the room." "You're predictable when you're thinking about something," she said. "You go quiet in a specific way." She sat down. "What are you thinking?" He was quiet in the specific way for another moment. Then, "The south parcel is 300 yards from the cabin, maybe 4. It's good flat ground where the trail levels out before the switchbacks." "I know where the south parcel is. If someone put up a structure there, a way station, like Pruitt says, they'd need someone to run it." She looked at him. "I'm a trapper," he said. "I know what I'm good at. I'm good at this mountain, and I'm good at working alone, and I know how to run a trap line and track game, and I know the terrain well enough to guide people through it." He paused. "I am not good at feeding people or managing the kind of operation Pruitt's describing." "I'm a cook," she said. "Best one I've ever known." "You haven't known many." "Enough to know what good is." He held her eyes. "The land claim that Pruitt helped file last year, the 40 acres east, it's ours. What we build on it or beside it is ours." Another pause. "I'm not saying build a city. I'm saying build something that uses what both of us are actually good at." She looked at the letter. She had cooked in other people's kitchens her entire adult life, in boarding houses, in private homes, in the house of a man who had tried to destroy her. She had made other people's tables the center of other people's lives. She had been thanked for it sometimes and invisible for it most of the time, and had learned to find the work itself satisfying regardless of what it was called. The idea of a kitchen that was hers, not just to cook in, but to build, to design, to run on her own terms, settled into her chest in a way that was almost physical. Not excitement exactly. Something slower and more serious than excitement, something that felt like the beginning of a plan. "Bread," she said. He looked at her. "If we're building a way station for travelers crossing the pass, they want two things: shelter and food. And the food they want most after 2 days on a mountain road is bread." She picked up the letter and read the parcel description again. "I can bake more than we'd need for the two of us on the same fire I'd use anyway. The incremental cost is almost nothing. The incremental value to a traveler who hasn't had fresh bread in a week is—" She stopped. "I watched how Voss operated his finances for 3 years. I know what value is." Thorne looked at her. "I know," he said. And then, because it had been 3 months since the morning he'd decided not to say it yet, and the waiting had done exactly what it was supposed to do. "I love you." She looked up from the letter. He held her gaze. He wasn't embarrassed by it and didn't look away and didn't add anything to it or qualify it. She held his gaze back. Something moved across her face. The full, complicated truth of it, all the pieces she carried, the fear and the wariness and the built thing underneath both of those. The thing that had been constructing itself out of honest mornings and practical evenings and a winter's worth of choosing this man and this mountain again and again with no guarantee of anything. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to get there." "How long?" She considered. "Since the fence, in April." He thought about the afternoon in April they'd worked the east fence, the particular way the light had come through the aspen trees. Her driving fence posts with the mallet, correcting her grip without being asked to. The moment he'd realized he wasn't thinking about Nesson. "That's when I knew too," he said. "I know that also," she said, and now the architecture of the smile was fully present. "You had the face." "I keep telling you I only have one face. And I keep telling you that isn't true." She set the letter down. "I love you too, Thorne. It isn't uncomplicated. I don't know that it's supposed to be." "Nothing worth anything is uncomplicated," he said. "That's either very wise or very convenient." "Probably both," he said. They broke ground on the way station in October before the first snow. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, and it went wrong in the specific ways that real things go wrong. The east wall of the main structure had to be reframed after Thorne discovered a flaw in the original foundation planning, which cost them 2 weeks and required a trip to Colder Creek for additional lumber that put them behind on the roof before the weather turned. They had one genuine argument about the kitchen layout that lasted 4 days and ended with Eliza's design largely intact, and Thorne acknowledging, in as few words as possible, that she understood kitchen flow better than he did, and he should have deferred earlier. She didn't press the point. The first travelers who stopped were a family in November, husband, wife, 3 children under 10, crossing the pass headed west with everything they owned loaded into 2 wagons. They were cold, and the children were difficult in the way cold, hungry children are difficult, and the wife had a look in her eyes that Eliza recognized, the look of a person who had committed to something and was in the middle of the part where commitment and reality were having their first serious argument. Eliza fed them. She didn't make a production of it. She put bread on the table and soup in bowls, and didn't comment on the chaos the children generated, and didn't perform sympathy in a way that would have felt like condescension. She just fed them. When they left the next morning, the wife stood at the door of the way station for a moment before getting back in the wagon. She looked at Eliza. Just looked, taking her in. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the food." Eliza nodded. She understood what was meant. The food was one thing. Being treated as a person rather than a problem was another. And sometimes after long enough on the road, those two things became difficult to separate. Thorne watched the wagon go from the yard. When he came back inside, he said, "You're good at this." "I've always been good at it," she said. "I just didn't always have the right kitchen." By December, they had hosted 11 parties of travelers. By February of the following year, it was a recognized stop on the pass route. Word traveled the way it always had among people crossing difficult terrain, person to person. The simple currency of there's a place on the south approach where they'll put you up and the bread is worth the price. They charged reasonably because Eliza had strong opinions about what reasonably meant, and Thorne deferred to them. They hired help in the spring, a young man named Cal from Colder Creek who was strong and reliable and completely incapable of making bread, which he acknowledged freely. Eliza taught him 3 things he could actually make, and left it at that. In April, a full year after the gunfight in the yard, a rider came up the south approach that Thorne recognized from the specific sound of the horse before the man came into view. Nesson. He was alone. He wasn't in his deputy uniform. He wore plain traveling clothes and his mustache needed more attention than the last time, and he looked, Thorne thought, like a man who had spent some months sitting with things he'd rather not sit with, and had eventually decided that sitting with them wasn't enough. Thorne met him in the yard. Nesson stopped his horse. He looked at the way station, the new structure, the sign Eliza had painted herself in clean, steady letters, Callahan's, Provisions and Rest. He looked at the garden plot she'd put in to the east of the cabin, which was not yet growing much but was clearly intended to. He looked at the general shape of the place, which had changed enough from the isolated cabin he'd ridden to twice before that it took him a moment to locate the cabin within the larger thing. "You built something," he said. "We built something," Thorne said. Nesson got down from his horse. He held the reins and looked at the ground for a moment, then at Thorne. "I'm not a deputy anymore," he said. "Resigned in September." Thorne waited. "I've been trying to figure out what I wanted to say to you since August when the Denver papers ran the story." Nesson looked up. "I didn't know all of it. I want you to understand that. I knew the warrant had problems. I knew Voss had particular reasons for wanting her found, but I told myself that wasn't my business, that my job was the document in my hand." He paused. "I've been a lawman for 12 years, and I always told myself I was one of the honest ones. I wasn't dishonest. I just convinced myself that following orders that came with a seal made me honest by definition." He stopped, seemed to run out of road on that sentence and not have another one ready. Thorne said nothing. "I'm sorry," Nesson said, "for what I brought up here." It was a simple statement, not elaborate, not heavily emotional, not performing, just the bare minimum of what was true, said by a man who had arrived at it the hard way. Thorne thought about what to do with it. He thought about what Eliza would say. He thought about a year of building and what it had cost and what it had built. Not just the structure by the trail, but the other things, the ones that didn't have walls. "You're welcome to come in," he said, "if you want coffee." Nesson looked at him. "That's all? You want me to make it harder?" A long pause. Something in Nesson's face went through a series of adjustments. "No," he said, "I don't." They went inside. Eliza was at the stove, the way station kitchen, not the cabin kitchen, which was bigger now and smelled of this morning's bread and last night's pine smoke. She looked at Nesson when he came in. She held the look for a moment, not cold, but not warm, the measured, honest look of a person deciding something in real time. She poured 3 cups of coffee. She set them on the table and sat down, and that was her answer. Not forgiveness, not performance of forgiveness, just the decision to be in the room with the man and treat him like a person and see what that amounted to. They talked for an hour, about small things mostly, the road conditions, the changes in Colder Creek, a new general store, a second doctor, what the spring was doing to the snowpack, the kind of conversation you had when the larger conversation was present but too big to walk into directly. Before Nesson left, he said to Eliza, "The porch." That day. He stopped. Tried again. "I've thought about it a lot." She waited. "I've been doing this job, had been doing it, since I was 24 years old. I've seen people scared. I've seen people angry. I've seen people desperate." He looked at her steadily. "I've never seen anyone look the way you looked when you walked out there." "How did I look?" she asked. She genuinely wanted to know. She'd never been able to see her own face in that moment. Nesson thought about it for a long moment. "Like you already knew the worst thing that could happen," he said, "and you decided it wasn't the worst thing anymore." She held that, turned it over. "Yes," she said. That's right. Nesson rode back down the mountain an hour later. They watched him go from the porch. The same porch, the post still carrying the scar from that first shot, which Thorne had never repaired because Eliza had said she wanted it left. It happened. Leave it. The sun was doing what the spring sun did at this elevation, low and sharp, and making the new snow on the upper ridges look like something that had been placed there deliberately. The aspens down the slope were just coming into leaf. The trail below them was empty and quiet, Nesson's horse a small moving shape growing smaller. "Do you believe him?" Thorne asked. "That he didn't know all of it." She thought about it honestly. "I believe he didn't know as much as Voss knew. I believe he knew more than he admitted to himself." She paused. "I believe he's a man who made a choice he's living with now. That's real, whatever else is." "Is that enough?" She looked at him. "It has to be enough to let him go. I can't carry him around on top of everything else." She leaned against the repaired porch post, not the scarred one, the other one. "That's not the same as forgiveness. I'm not interested in performing that." "What are you interested in?" She looked out at the mountain. Her mountain now, in the way that the fence and the kitchen and the sign she'd painted were hers. Not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had put herself into it until it held her shape. "This," she said, simply. "I'm interested in this." He stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The trail and the aspens and the high ridges and the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful fact of the wilderness that had tried to kill her once and then, almost despite itself, given her somewhere to land. There was nothing perfect about what they'd built. The way station roof leaked in one corner that Thorne hadn't solved yet. Cal had broken a good cast iron pan last week and hadn't confessed to it, which Eliza had noticed and had not yet decided whether to address. The financial accounting was running behind because neither of them had the patience for bookkeeping, and they needed to find someone who did. The east fence needed work again. There were 100 small things wrong that would need attention, and 100 more that would become wrong before those were fixed, because that was the nature of building anything real. It required constant maintenance, and most of it was unglamorous. But the bread was good. The travelers kept coming. The mountain was theirs in every way that mattered. And the woman standing on the porch had walked out into a gunfight in April of the previous year and claimed this place is worth defending, and nothing that had happened since had given her reason to regret it. Thorne looked at her profile in the spring light. He thought about a blizzard, about a boot catching on something that wasn't a root, about the specific weight of a person in a wrong-season coat being carried through 20 minutes of white noise toward a fire, about 4 words he'd said to a deputy's face that he hadn't planned and hadn't regretted for a single day since. She turned and looked at him, found him already looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the mountain. "Cal needs to be told about the pan," she said. "I know. He thinks I haven't noticed. He's young. He's going to be young and without a job if he doesn't stop hoping I'm not paying attention." She pushed off the post. "Come inside. There's bread from this morning, and I need someone to taste the new recipe." She went in. He stood on the porch for one more moment. The trail below was empty now, Nesson long gone around the first bend. The mountain held its own council the way it always had, enormous and specific and completely unconcerned with the small human dramas enacted on its slopes. It had been here before Thorne. It would be here after. What he and Eliza had built on it was, in the scale of mountains, barely a whisper. But a whisper was something. A whisper in the right ear at the right moment could change a life. He was evidence of that. He went inside. The bread was good. It always was.